So welcome to this installment of the Grand Rapids Community College Social Sciences Department Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. We have today a film that we'll be showing shortly, and then afterwards a panel discussion. I'm Steve Abid, and I teach economics, and I'll be facilitating the discussion. The documentary we're about to see is entitled 1964, and it's based on a book that was entitled The Last Innocent Year, America in 1964, the beginning of the 60s. So this is somewhat of a pivotal time in US history, as you'll see in the documentary, and it bridges all of the different disciplines of the social sciences. So that's why I thought it was an important one to use for this presentation, and hopefully you'll enjoy not only the presentation itself, but also the panel discussion and gain some insight, hopefully. After the documentary is done, we will introduce our panelists, comprised of faculty members from the social sciences, and hopefully you'll enjoy their insights, but also be free to ask some questions as we get to that time. So the documentary itself is a little bit short of 2 hours. I know that's a long time, but I think you'll discover that it doesn't seem like it moves slowly. It seems to go pretty fast. So we have, from left to right, Professor Yun Bai, political science, Professor Dylan Carr, anthropology, Professor Susan Williams, history, and Professor Cedric Williams, teacher of sociology, professor of sociology, and I teach economics. I'll just be facilitating. So I'd like to ask, starting with Dr. Bai, just for a comment or a statement, something about the documentary, and then we'll work our way across, and then we'll sort of open it up to questions or comments from the audience.
I'm very excited to watch this film. I saw this like 3 times already. This is my 3rd time. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I mean, in 1964, I was 9 years old. I was in Beijing, China. I was not in here. Just like that person said, if I would pay to go back, I would like to go back. I would like to go back to live my 1964 in the United States. It's very exciting. And that's about it. Well, for now.
I'm a little younger than Professor Bai, so I have to think about going back in time a little bit. So I get the advantage of retrospect. So history is always easier to write when you're looking back at it from sort of the times past in that regard. I think one thing that strikes out there from an anthropological perspective is this looking at all the different intersections between different facets of society that I think that one of the things that changed was that we have a tendency to sort of gloss over them and sort of blend them together to make society look sort of unified in that regard. And I think the video sort of talked about that a couple different times, and that those that started fragmenting, that various stressors occur within a society, and what we tend to see and looking back at it with the vantage point that we have is that it tends to fragment along those social lines that we have established and maintained. And I think one of the important threads that comes in there then is the issue of legitimacy that comes into it. You can see kind of different elements of it in that a lot of the civil rights movement, particularly by African American activists, was really sort of the illusion of the legitimacy of police and government officials, particularly in different parts, has started to sort of break down in the sense that I think one of the video's commenters were talking about how when he was young, the police officer would come and talk to him, and they would leave the corner and sort of listen. There was a degree of sort of legitimacy to authority that individuals sort of were responding to. And what had emerged and sort of came to a head in 1964 was this idea that that sort of some of these political structures might not necessarily have that constituent legitimacy that they've seen, and so that they felt obligated to respond or protest against that. And so that was on the very sort of extreme left side of it, with the civil rights movement questioning sort of the immediate legitimacy at sort of local levels. And then over on the right side of it, you saw that with Barry Goldwater's campaign, and really sort of questioning the over legitimacy of the federal government compared to states' rights in that regard. So it's kind of an interesting, you see all these different intersections and sort of contrasts. Muhammad Ali fighting the Beatles, which is this incredible footage. But then even within sort of the way that the political activization was coming, is you saw both sides really wrestling with this idea of what is the nature of the word freedom, and really what is really the legitimate form that our sort of societal institutions of government should take. Should it be something that's inherently a small government, or should the federal government sort of take a stand to promote those individual sort of liberties in that? So that was kind of, for me, one of the neat trends that sort of came out there.
Susan?
I'll be like the negative person, because I usually am right about this stuff. I think that it's a really good video. I think it introduces a lot of very complex issues in a way that I think it kind of highlighted some of the complexities. And the reason I say that I'm going to be a little bit negative is, as a historian, we know that there's been a specific history of the 1960s constructed by white intellectuals in particular. And I think that this spoke quite a bit to the nostalgia, where people keep talking about how they want to go back to the period, and that and there's a specific story, and this kind of gets me to even the title of the documentary, which is The Loss of Innocence. And you have to think to yourself, and I kind of always encourage my students to be critical about these types of frameworks that are being set up, because you have to think to yourself, like, who's losing innocence here? Because there's a lot of working class people in the United States, there's a lot of very poor people in Appalachia in this period of time who didn't have the luxury to be innocent. There's a lot of black people living under the Jim Crow South and all of those restrictions who, again, didn't have the ability to be innocent in the period leading up to this. So what they're really talking about is a loss of blinders for a specific group in society, where they have to actually start to confront very complex issues and lose what they've been taught is the truth of the United States. And I think that it starts to introduce a lot of really important issues here. But because it's trying to do a lot with a lot of different topics, it kind of loses some of the consistency that it should have. For example, they introduced the women's movement, and I'm the coordinator of gender studies here at the college, and it's something that I'm very interested in, the American, the American women's movement from its inception on. And they bring in Betty Friedan, and they bring in this story of American women being upset and having ennui, but they're talking about a very tiny minority of women there. These are very wealthy housewives, a lot of whom actually have a college education themselves, who never got to do anything with that, right? But there's all kinds of groups of women. African American women are earning 40 cents to the dollar for the exact same job that a white man does in 1963. Right? There are real things that people have been facing for a long time. Women living through the Jim Crow South and living through the civil rights movement. There's incredible vileness. There's rape. There's abuse in particular that are targeted on women in a way that men aren't targeted living in the Jim Crow South. And what's very interesting to me is when we do these big stories like this, we lose those nuances that tell a much more deeper, much more complex story. I'm not saying that it's not valuable. It's good to have these kinds of things to introduce these basic stories to people who don't know it. But I do think that we have to be careful about that nostalgia at the same time.
Okay, good. Cedric?
Thanks, Steve. Well, as the old man of the group, I guess, I was 14 at that time in 1964, so I actually did get a chance to live through it. It wasn't very nostalgic at all, and Susan has already alluded to that. It was only for a small group of individuals. At that particular time, I couldn't go swimming in certain places. I was not able to go to certain restaurants. I was not able to go to certain parks and to be able to play. I was not safe in certain neighborhoods. So for me, it was not, or it's not nostalgic at all. It did bring back a lot of memories to me, but it also brought back to me the idea that Susan talked about in terms of legitimacy. The federal government, the states, actually lost legitimacy prior to that, but they're going back to '64 to say that this is a nostalgic time. And rebellion started in 1964, according to the film. Well, not really. Rebellion had started a long time before that, but they're using 1964 to say, well, rebellion actually started. Well, rebellion's going on today. It has been going on prior to 1964. Has there been some social change and social revolution? Yes, there has been quite a bit of change. Early on, I would not have been able to sit here with my colleagues, but today I'm able to do so. But it doesn't mean that the society has changed completely. Would I like to go back to 1964? Sure, I wouldn't mind it at all. But just to undo some of the things that I messed up in 1964, not the things that it was such a great time or anything like that. So I'm not nostalgic about it. It was nice hearing Sam Cooke sing, but that doesn't really make you understand the time in which things that were happening, I should say, in 1964. In fact, it was a very difficult time, and in fact, it was also a time that's quite scary, in fact. We had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was talked about in terms of the film. The Cold War was going on at that time. There was a great deal of concern about whether or not we were actually going to get into World War III. There was fear in terms of not only the police, but also in terms of our military, issues in terms of not only gender rights, civil rights, rights for women, rights for gays, rights for lesbians, all different kinds of wars going on at that particular time. So there was a great deal of social unrest going on at that time as well. While the film doesn't show you all of that, it actually leaves out quite a bit of actually what was going on. But that's about all I've got to add to that. Thank you.
No problem. Professor Light is not here. He had to attend a meeting, so the list of our participants is a little bit off, but that's okay because we have enough of perspective on this to, I think, add to the conversation. The reason that I was intrigued enough to bring this and to show it, I also was 9 years old in 1964. Professor Bai and I share that. We were born the same year. I thought it was interesting for me that the year actually started in the film, as they mentioned, on November 22nd, 1963. Because for me, that is a day that I will never forget. That was the day President Kennedy was assassinated. And for those of us here in Grand Rapids, where I've lived all my life, Michigan was not necessarily a democratic state back then. This part of the town, West Michigan, was not particularly democratic. But for young Catholic kids like myself, to have a president get elected that was Roman Catholic was huge. And for us, it was a measure of our achievement in this country that the Pope was not going to control the United States, that we could have somebody that practiced the same faith that we did. And to me, one of the interesting things is, as we move forward 50 years, is what a big role faith plays in elections, but not in the same way that it did in 1964. And President Kennedy had to sort of remove his Catholicism from who he was and so on. So when that assassin's bullet cut him down so violently, and it was on TV, which was the thing that probably transformed us the most, that all of this played out on our television sets, in our homes, in a way that had never happened before with events like that. That left a big mark, I think, on our generation. And so going into 1964, the country was in a strange and difficult emotional state, not knowing how to properly finish grieving for a president, whether you voted for him or not, whether you were old enough to know about it or not. You felt something was different. And then the second thing for me was the Beatles arriving and the music and that comment that they make about kids growing their hair long. And it would be hard to imagine looking at me today, but that was an argument that my dad and I had at our house. And you look at those haircuts, that was long, but today we wouldn't think anything of it. And so I remember when our oldest child wanted to wear his hair a certain way, and my wife made a comment, about we need to tell him what to do with his hair. And I said, I'm not going to tell any of my kids how they're going to wear their hair, because I just hated that argument at my house growing up. So that, on a personal level, was the part that sort of registered with me. I remember hearing about the kids in Mississippi that later were found buried and had been shot and so on. Of course, we've watched the movie Mississippi Burning, and some of these other things that have come along in the past. So to me, it brought some of those things. I would not want to go back either. Being 9 years old in 1964 had some fun aspects, but I know all the things that were going to come after that, and I don't want to go through those again myself. What about one other comment from each of you, and then we'll ask the audience if they have any questions or anything that they want to add. If anything that you left off of your original comment or something you thought of later. Anybody?
In 19... Oh.
Yeah, I think we can only go so far with that.
Just a personal note, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. In 1964, I was in Beijing. I was in the primary school. I was told to go to a ceremony to say goodbye to the Vietnamese pilots who were training in China. So that's what I remember. And they were trained in the Chinese Air Force. They finished their training. They would go back to Vietnam to fight the war. So 1964, that's the year when the war was escalating. So that's something I remember in 1964.
Interesting. Anybody else?
I think we're going to wrestle with this the whole time. I'll just try to talk loud, I guess.
Here, this one.
I'm in between the middle.
Or you can do that. There you go. Yeah.
We were kind of doing just a little bit of sort of poking around, looking for sort of threads to look at and talk about this. I know I'm messing with the camera guy, but this is my good side. And I ran as a quick Google Ngram, which allows you to track the relative frequency of different terms sort of place. And sort of when you run the terms like civil rights and that, what you see is this immense spike that shows up in that terminology. Right in the 1960s really is that peak of growth, and then it plateaus after that. And 1964 then becomes sort of that midpoint of that shift. And really that's kind of what people are sort of pointing out, is that it's not so much that 1964 is the isolated year where all this stuff went on and then everybody forgot about it. And it's not just that just a few things that the video was able to cover, as Susan points out, were the only things going on and the only relative things in terms of people's lived experience, but it becomes sort of a microcosm or a metaphor for really what was occurring at the time. And what you see then is this burst into our consciousness of this term civil rights, and in terms of what that really represents. And then as the video was talking about sort of the contrast or the response on the part of the Goldwater campaign and the young conservative movement. And one of the things that strikes me that really sort of came about was this really the emergence of societal structures in terms of our consciousness. So if you think about discrimination and segregation and all those things that prior to the 1960s and the emergence of the civil rights into the American consciousness, is a lot of that was looked at in terms of those individual relationships, that this is what we're doing, and you're sort of playing those out, and those are kind of your lived sort of experiences where I think people became a lot more consciously aware of broader societal structures that are much more impersonable, that you don't have sort of a treatment that I might be interacting with individuals on a daily basis, say in the South as an individual, and that's something that's tangible, but you don't really see any sort of broader implications of that in that regard. And I think once people start thinking about sort of the structural implications of segregation and that they begin to think about things in a little bit of a different sense. And I think it's that consciousness of thinking about things rather than it's not, I'm a good person if I treat somebody with respect and sort of interaction. Whereas even if I might be personally nice with somebody, that doesn't mean that some of my actions or even complacency to that doesn't put barriers onto people because we're conforming in these broader structures. And so I think a lot of the civil rights movement was a push towards that, of saying that, hey, even on the individual level we don't have problems, but when we look at these broader relationships, that's where a lot of these injustices and inequalities are persisting. And President Johnson grasps that, I think, and that's really why he was making a strong push for a lot of federal legislation, that all of these were designed at saying that, all right, we have structures of society that we feel are unjust in that, and let's try to do something to target them. And you can argue about the effectiveness of them over time, and then you get a reaction against that, which is if we're going to deal with stuff at broader institutional levels, then other people feel alienated for that. And that's where you see with the young conservative movement of this promotion for individual liberty and individual freedom. And what they're saying is that they want that individual freedom to move apart from those structures of society that we're shifting there. So you kind of see those two tensions that I think sort of encapsulate what's going on, and apart from a lot of the individual issues that were occurring underneath the surface. Not to devalue those, as those are very much important, but for what it's worth.
Okay, good. Cedric or Susan?
I guess, I mean, the other thing that I would kind of bring in here is I think that a lot of it's an American experience, so it's really focused in heavily on America. What it doesn't really talk about is the fact that you've got a lot of Cold War propaganda going on, and the problem for the United States, particularly with the civil rights movement, is it suddenly becomes extraordinarily apparent that the United States is not the group that they say they are, right, on this international stage. Soviet propaganda in this period of time, and East European propaganda, really focuses on the idea of social justice, that it's the thing that they have that the United States does not have. And they will regularly talk about civil rights, they'll talk about the South in the United States, and it's something that, you know, when all this breaks apart, suddenly you realize that all this propaganda that's been going on since 1948 is a lie. Right? And Americans are actually forced to confront for the first time ever that the things that people are talking about, how we are the land of democracy, well, a lot of people down south can't vote, right? And we're the land of freedom and we're the land of equality, but a lot of people down south aren't equal, right? In the same period of time, from 1948 on, in East Europe and Russia, their educational systems are good. There's gender equality, or at least there's something like gender equality where women don't get fired for being women at their jobs. And there was a big story about the fact that in communist countries, there wasn't supposed to be racism. And when all of this breaks apart, one thing that they have to face, and we've got to think, Johnson's not the most idealistic human being. He's not doing this because deep down in his heart, he feels like this is the good thing to do. That might have been part of the story, but he's an executive leader, and he realizes that America had to start putting its money where its mouth is, or it was going to lose the Cold War, right? It was going to lose the hearts and minds of people. And when Vietnam starts up, right? And it starts to heat up in this period of time. That's, it starts as a communist rebellion. And suddenly, they're faced with this idea that either you have to deal with this on the world stage, and all of this was hitting international newspapers, right? Left and right. And it was used as propaganda in communist countries, right? About, look, we told you what was really going on there, right? And how all of this was a lie. on a geopolitical stage, you have to play the right cards at this point, right? Particularly because the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and because everything is heating up and everybody's paranoid about what's going on down south. So I also think that it's good to think about these things in big geopolitical terms as well, right? It's not saying that everybody's not ideological. It's not saying that people aren't idealistic, but you do have to think about the political savvy that's going on in the background here as well.
Yeah,
there's-
good point. Thanks.
There's quite a bit that was actually left out, and you can see in the film that it's actually slanted quite a bit, as Susan has mentioned, and I don't want to stop the question, so I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Go ahead. If you have.
If you look at the film, the only time that you really see people of color, of whatever group that people belong to, is really as it relates to the civil rights movement. There's no mention about people attending college, graduating from high school, doing well. You have to remember that industrialization after World War II, we are a very prosperous nation, but you don't see that as a whole. All you see is whites doing quite well. You see the little woman that's at home who's having some difficulty because of having to do this, but you don't see people of color anywhere in terms of what's going on within the communities, what's going on at home.
Even in the home movies.
Exactly right.
They were all white people in the home movies that they talked about American prosperity.
Yeah, and it's almost like the people that were in the movies did not have people of color that they actually knew or interacted with or anything. So you don't see that at all.
You mean the home movies, right?
In the home movies,
Yeah.
but in the film in general,
Yeah.
you don't see that. The only time that you pan to that is when you're dealing with civil rights, and there were a lot of other things going on at that particular time as well. Even within the African American community, even within the African American family, there was a lot going on.
Yep. Good point. All right. Are there any questions or comments from any of the students that are here?
Students go first.
I didn't see any. So
All right.
We'll go here.
I think the criticisms that were brought up, and especially what Cedric just talked about now with not seeing black people outside of the civil rights movement and all this, do you think that's attributed to the lack of cultural artifacts and the fact, I think now we're a videotape everything society, and when we go to make a documentary 50 years from now about 2014, there's going to be all sorts of cats playing piano videos, but there's going to be other people represented. We also didn't see poverty represented, for example, as well. Do you think that's a sign of the times, and that might be why we're so intensively obsessed with recording everything?
I don't think that. I think what happens is that sometimes our focus is so focused on trying to complete the film, but you miss the broader implications of what's actually going on at that particular time. I don't think that it's just a video issue. I think it goes even deeper than that in terms of where people did not want to, at that particular time, identify with people of color the way that people today might identify with people of color. When you look at the social distance scales were like, fine, let them have a job, let them go here, but I don't want them as my neighbor. So I think what the filmmakers did was make a choice. We can show everything that went on at that particular time, or we can just zoom in on specific aspects of it. But I don't think it's just because of the video. I think what they did was they made a free choice to decide not to be inclusive. And they really should have been inclusive, because there was so much more going on at that particular time than just President Kennedy being assassinated. I mean, that was one of the few times that I actually got to see my mother cry, was when he was assassinated, and then again when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. But while it was a difficult time, there were a lot of other things going on other than Annette Funicello and I'm blanking now, thank you, Frankie Avalon. There were other things going on. Hitsville, USA, they were talking about Martha and the Vandellas, but there were other songs that were going on as well. And so it's nice that they put the film together, but it would have been better, to me at least, if they had been more inclusive of everybody, more so than they were. Yeah.
And I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, you always make choices when you make documentary films, but I think you're specifically talking as well about choice, like the evidence that they're using here. Black people had home movies.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of them. There's lots of images. There's
Right.
lots. They could have made better choices. And the story that's emerging is white people are successful
Right.
and had white-collar jobs, and
Right.
they were the affluent middle class, and then black people were poor.
Right.
And so making those kinds of choices specifically to tell a story is kind of disingenuous with those sources, I would say.
And also, even in 1964, my father was middle class. My mother and father were middle class, even at that time, and living above the national average, but still not inclusive in terms of this particular film, which really does a disservice to anyone, any person of color, has basically been relegated to, it's strictly a civil rights issue for you, but it's not about you doing well or making progress and all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you could comment on the use of the term innocence. I really have a hard time understanding why would anybody think before 1964 that the United States was innocent in any way, either domestically or internationally. What does that mean, loss of innocence? What it is that America, according to the movie at least, was really losing? What does this innocence mean in this particular context?
I think innocence means before 1964, Americans were aware how the system would work. There was a sense of unity, peace, but after the assassination of President Kennedy, I think American people got confused, and they started to wonder, to ask where the country should go. So I think the last year of innocence means that American people started to revolt, to challenge, to rethink. They were no longer just content with the lives they have been living for so long. That's what I got.
Well, for me, really, it probably shouldn't be used, but to answer your question, Gordon, it was only innocence in terms of white America. African Americans, they're in middle class. African Americans, even middle class African Americans, already knew long before JFK was assassinated that the system was not a legitimate system at all. It was disingenuous from the beginning all the way up through his assassination, and even after that. To say that it was innocence is really, to me, it's more of a misnomer, because I wasn't innocent, and nobody in the country was innocent, at least if they had the ability to look and see what was going on. The only people that were innocent were the ones who refused to look and see what was going on.
And now they were forced to.
Exactly right. And so now, because you had Cheney and Schwerner and Goodman, they had been finding bodies a long time. So this is not something new. Lynchings had occurred in the South for a long time, and still have occurred in the South. So you still understand that lynching is not something that ended in 1964. Okay, it continued to go on. So bodies were still being found after that period of time, but it was innocent for certain people within the society, within this country, who refused to acknowledge what was really going on within the country. And pretty much they just wore rose-colored glasses, so to speak, and said, Oh, yeah, it's lovely, it's wonderful. It's why you don't try to teach your students. It's a wonderful place, great things going on. You have to show them the other side of the world, of what's actually going on within the country as well as with outside of the country.
I think that point there is probably the biggest one, is that this innocence was the white middle class, probably males more than women in some ways, that were forced to see scenes that they didn't want to see, forced to deal with their own treatment of other people or their lack of attempts to change things that they knew were probably wrong, or to think about those kinds of things. Any other questions or comments?
Steve, let me say also, it's also very hypocritical as well to when they show the film to act as if nobody knew what was really going on. People knew, but they didn't want to acknowledge what was going on. It's not like this is just a revelation that just came about now and, oh, we didn't know. People knew, but they just looked at it as, well, okay, all right, well, let it go.
Ignorance is bliss sometimes.
That's what they say.
Any other questions? Any last comments?
Can I make a?
Yes.
I really appreciate the African Americans who struggled, fought so hard for civil rights, equality. I mean, for people, people of color, people from other countries, people like me. I mean, we came in here, in late 1980s. I mean, we got here. I mean, it's much better now. The life was much better than 1964. I mean, we enjoyed the result, fought, gained by people who fought for us, but we never participated. I mean, we that's why I said I wish to leave 1964 in here, not in China anymore. I would join.
Dylan, anything?
Trying to think of a good way to summarize it, but I think the points that were made is that specifically what the video is talking about is sort of this awakening among sort of the broad, typical suburban middle class, predominantly European of ancestry individuals, and that's what they're focusing on with the innocence. And it seems like the author of the book grew up as a white middle class suburban kid, and a lot of the people they're talking about, like a lot of the Berkeley students, were white middle class kids. And so I think it's good that we've gotten a lot of comments that sort of inject a lot of other people's experiences into that. But then from the perspective of what's really going on from the idea of loss of innocence was this idea that the old sort of power structures, the hegemony that sort of white males of European ancestry had dominated over the American sort of consciousness really was crumbling down, in part because you can keep that sort of idea of a societal order only too long before it eventually crumbles underneath the weight of its own internal contradictions. And I think that was one of the important threads that the makers of the video were trying to do, was show how many of those contradictions were in place. And then what ends up emerging is one of those starts fragmenting, and you see that's contradicting the bland narrative of control, that the other one starts falling, and another one starts falling, and another one starts falling, which makes 1964 as a year such a poignant marker in that all of these different things sort of erupt into sort of a visible sort of way. And then after that, we've really sort of removed that old sort of ideal that too many people had sort of used to paste over and ignore a lot of those underlying fault lines in society that were and are problematic still.
Okay, good.
I'm cool.
You can get the last word.
I'm good.
Okay. First of all, I want to, to me, in summary, the two things. One, adding on to what had already been said, is that 1964, the work had been going on, and it didn't end in 1964, and it's not done yet, right? I mean, all of these things we sometimes even gloss over them today when we think about the differences in wages, the differences in hiring practices, the attacks on public education from both governmental authorities and people in different levels of society. So the civil rights movement, the student movement, the gender movement, the sexual identity movement, all of those things, that work is still going on. It didn't start in 1964, but I think a lot of people knew something they didn't know before 1964, and to me that was one of the main things. The other thing was the political aspect, and I knew about Barry Goldwater. Being a 9-year-old, I didn't know that much about politics, but I knew that I didn't like him, and mainly because he wasn't John Kennedy. But the founding of the modern conservative movement, I thought that came through very, very clear. Those same attacks are the ones you hear today. All you have to do is listen to the CPAC speeches or the campaign for whatever office you want, and those messages that were first introduced at that point on a broader scale, and especially Ronald Reagan's talk, those are the comments that still come out anytime government gets involved or attempts to look at a problem. You'll hear about this intrusive big government, and then you'll hear people on the other side of the aisle saying government's not the enemy. Government is the people. So I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. And last but not least for me was the intersection of the disciplines in our department that come out so clearly in this movie, whether they told the whole story or not, but we have a historical perspective, we have an anthropological perspective, we have a sociological perspective, we have an economic perspective, and we have a political science perspective, and we have geography throughout, just based on regional, right? The regions of the country and the different aspects. So to me, that's why I wanted to have a panel that I thought was inclusive of a lot of different folks in our department from their various discipline perspectives and then their own experiences. So with that, please help me thank the panelists for being here and thank all of you for coming.